The first sign that Margaret Ellison's quiet life was about to fracture came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a roadside diner just outside a small logging town in northern Washington. The diner sat where the state highway narrowed and bent toward the mountains, surrounded by dense fir trees that swallowed sound and light. Margaret had been coming there every week since her husband, Thomas, died 18 months earlier. She liked the way the place smelled of cinnamon and black coffee, and she appreciated that the owner, a stooped man with tired eyes, never asked questions about grief. That afternoon she was seated in a worn vinyl booth across from her son, Daniel, and his wife, Rebecca. Rain streaked the windows, turning the parking lot into a blurred sheet of gray. Daniel kept checking his watch. Rebecca stirred her tea endlessly, the spoon tapping porcelain in an irritating rhythm that made Margaret's jaw tighten. "You've been alone too long out there," Rebecca said at last, her tone soft but practiced. "The ranch is too much for one person." Daniel nodded quickly. He had inherited his father's dark hair, but none of his patience. "We're worried about you, Mom. Winter's coming. Repairs, property taxes, it's not realistic anymore." Margaret offered a thin smile. "I've managed that land for 43 years. I think I can survive another winter." Rebecca and Daniel exchanged a glance they thought was subtle. It wasn't. Mothers rarely missed those silent conversations. They stood to pay, leaning close together as they spoke in hushed tones. Margaret remained seated, gathering her purse, when she sensed someone beside her. A woman stood there, tall, wrapped in a charcoal coat too heavy for the season. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled tightly back, her expression composed but urgent. "Margaret Ellison," the woman said, not asking. Margaret stiffened. "Yes?" The woman slid a slim envelope onto the table. "You'll need this tonight. Don't open it here." Before Margaret could respond, the woman turned and walked away with quick, purposeful strides. She disappeared into the rain before Margaret found her voice. Daniel and Rebecca returned moments later. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked. "Fine," Margaret replied too quickly. She slipped the envelope into her bag, her pulse suddenly racing. The drive back to the ranch passed in a haze of forced conversation about housing markets and assisted living communities. Daniel dropped her off at the gravel entrance and declined her offer to come inside. His car disappeared down the long road, red taillights swallowed by mist. The ranch house sat at the edge of a wide clearing bordered by forest. It had belonged to Thomas's family for generations. Margaret stood on the porch for a moment, feeling the weight of something shifting in her life, something she could not yet see clearly. Inside, she locked the door. She hadn't made a habit of locking doors before Thomas died. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. She placed it on the kitchen table and stared at it as dusk thickened outside. When darkness settled fully over the property, she finally opened it. Inside lay a small iron key wrapped in tissue and a folded slip of paper. On the paper were 4 words and a time. 11:18 p.m. Answer. Say nothing else. Her throat tightened. She checked the clock. 8:02. The hours crept forward painfully. She tried reading. She failed. She brewed tea she never drank. The house creaked as night settled in. At 11:18 exactly, her phone rang. Unknown number. Margaret hesitated only a second before answering. Silence. Then controlled breathing. "Margaret," a low voice said. Her heart stopped. The voice sounded exactly like Thomas. "That's not possible," she whispered. "Listen carefully," the voice continued. "Do not trust Daniel. Do not trust Rebecca. And do not involve the sheriff." Her knees weakened. "Who is this?" "What happened to me wasn't an accident," the voice said. "They need the ranch cleared. The land is the key." The line crackled. Static filled her ear. "There's something beneath it," the voice continued hurriedly. "Under the East Ridge. I hid proof. If they force you out, it disappears. The call ended abruptly. Margaret stood frozen in the dark kitchen, phone still pressed to her ear. Thomas had died in what authorities ruled a single-vehicle crash on a mountain road. His truck had gone over a guardrail. She had mourned him as a victim of bad weather and bad luck. Now doubt seeped into her bones. The next morning, Daniel arrived unannounced. He walked in carrying coffee, scanning the room with sharp eyes that lingered too long on Thomas's study door. "We need to talk," Daniel said. Margaret watched him carefully. "About what?" "Selling. It's time. We've spoken with an attorney. If you're unwilling, we may need to discuss temporary conservatorship." The word struck like a slap. Rebecca arrived soon after, holding a folder. "Your accounts show decline," she said briskly. "You can't sustain this lifestyle. It's irresponsible." Margaret felt clarity settle inside her like stone. The timing was no coincidence. "If I refuse?" she asked quietly. Rebecca didn't hesitate. "Then we proceed legally." Daniel avoided her gaze. After they left, Margaret went straight to Thomas's study for the first time since his funeral. Dust lay lightly across the desk. She opened filing cabinets methodically. Everything looked ordinary at first glance: insurance forms, maintenance logs, tax records. But deeper inside, tucked behind old deeds, she found irregular cash withdrawals from Thomas's personal account. Small amounts, spread out, careful. Thomas had hated cash. At the back of the drawer lay a sealed envelope addressed to her. "If you're reading this, I couldn't fix it alone." Her hands trembled. The note was brief, but unmistakable. He had discovered something on the property. Activity that didn't belong. He warned her not to confront anyone without evidence. Margaret turned to his computer. It took 3 attempts before she unlocked it using the name of his childhood dog. Archived emails filled a hidden folder. Correspondence with a private investigator. Photographs taken at night near the Eastern Ridge. Tire tracks, unfamiliar equipment, men she did not recognize. Her stomach dropped. A vibration interrupted her thoughts. "Unknown number. You've started looking. Don't stop. They're watching." She walked to the living room window. A dark pickup truck rolled slowly past the entrance to her property. It did not stop, but an hour later, it passed again. That evening, her phone rang once more. "My name is Aaron Pike," a man said quietly. "Your husband hired me." Margaret sat down slowly. "There's an old mining tunnel beneath the East Ridge," Aaron continued. "Long forgotten by county records. It was expanded years ago. Someone's been using it." "For what?" she asked. "Illegal storage. Transfers. High-value shipments that require privacy." Margaret closed her eyes. "Thomas confronted Daniel," Aaron said. "Daniel promised to step away, but people above him wouldn't allow it." The world tilted. Thomas tried to document everything. That's when the accident happened. Margaret's breathing slowed into something dangerously calm. "They're accelerating plans," Aaron warned. "If they gain legal control of you, they gain control of the land. Once it's developed, everything disappears." Just after midnight, there was a knock at her door. Not loud, controlled. "Mom," Daniel called. "We just want to make sure you're okay." A second voice followed. "Ma'am, this is Deputy Harris." Margaret felt the weight of the key in her pocket. She understood. This wasn't concern. It was extraction. She moved silently toward the back door instead, and stepped into the freezing night. The cold air hit Margaret Ellison's lungs like broken glass as she moved through the darkness behind the ranch house. Frost clung to the tall grass, and each step sent a sharp crackle through the night. She kept low, heart hammering, the iron key digging into her palm. Behind her, voices carried across the yard. Daniel's urgent, Rebecca's sharper, controlled, and the deeper command of Deputy Harris. Flashlights swept across the clearing. "Mom," Daniel shouted. "Stop this." Margaret didn't stop. She moved toward the eastern ridge, toward the section of forest Thomas had warned her about for years. He had always framed it as unstable ground, old shafts from early mining days, places where someone could fall and never be found. She had believed him. Now she understood he had been protecting more than her footing. Branches clawed at her coat. The forest thickened, swallowing sound. She forced herself to slow once she reached the tree line. Panic would make her careless, and Daniel knew this land almost as well as she did. She angled toward a narrow deer path that curved downhill before cutting back toward the ridge from the east. Thomas had shown it to her decades earlier when they first walked the property as newlyweds. Hardly anyone used it. It bypassed the obvious routes. Behind her, the beams of light scattered through the trees, moving in uneven arcs. They were searching fast, not smart. Margaret crouched behind a fallen cedar log and listened. "Spread out," Deputy Harris called. "She can't have gone far." She closed her eyes and forced her breathing steady. In her coat pocket was the small flashlight Thomas had always kept by the back door. She resisted turning it on. The moon, though thin, gave her enough to navigate. When the voices drifted west, she slipped deeper into the woods. The eastern ridge rose ahead, a darker shadow against the sky. The ground grew rockier, uneven. She remembered Thomas coming back from this area 2 summers before his death, boots caked with red clay that didn't match the soil elsewhere on the ranch. He had claimed he'd been clearing brush. Now she knew better. After 15 minutes that felt like an hour, she reached a shallow depression hidden by thick brush and fallen branches. Thomas had once joked that if pirates ever buried treasure on their land, this was where they'd choose. Margaret dropped to her knees. Her fingers moved frantically through frozen soil and leaf litter. The earth was harder than she expected.
Nils Tore.
Skin split. She kept digging. Then plastic. She cleared more dirt away, revealing the edge of a heavy waterproof container wedged beneath roots and rock. She braced her feet and pulled. It resisted, then came free with a sucking sound of released earth. Footsteps cracked behind her. A beam of light locked onto her face. "There!" Daniel's voice. Margaret didn't hesitate. She grabbed the container and ran downhill, not back toward the house, but toward the old logging road that cut along the lower boundary of the property. Thomas had insisted on keeping that access road clear even after it stopped being used. Now she understood why. Her lungs burned. Her legs threatened to give out. The container was heavier than she expected, but adrenaline dulled the strain. "Mom," Daniel's voice cracked, closer now. "You don't know what you're doing." She risked a glance back. Daniel was only 30 yards behind, flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. His expression wasn't fear for her safety. It was desperation. "You can't turn this in," he shouted. "You'll ruin everything." Ruin. The word clarified everything Margaret needed to know. Ahead, headlights flickered between the trees. A vehicle idled at the edge of the logging road, engine low and steady. The passenger door swung open. "Margaret!" A woman's voice called urgently.
"Now!"
Margaret didn't pause to question. She sprinted the last stretch, stumbled once, regained balance, and threw herself into the passenger seat, dragging the container with her. The door slammed. The SUV accelerated before Daniel reached the road. Margaret twisted in her seat just long enough to see him emerge from the trees, chest heaving, flashlight dangling uselessly at his side. He didn't chase further. He knew he couldn't catch a vehicle. The woman driving kept her eyes forward. Mid-40s, dark hair pulled into a low ponytail, jaw set with controlled focus. "My name is Elise Carter," she said. "I worked with Aaron Pike. Your husband contacted us a year before he died." Margaret struggled to steady her breathing. "He never told me. He didn't want you involved unless there was no other choice." They drove in silence for several miles before Elise turned onto a gravel access road leading to an abandoned grain storage facility. The structure loomed against the night sky, skeletal and forgotten. Only when they were inside the empty warehouse did Elise cut the engine. "Open it," Elise said quietly. Margaret set the container on a rusted metal table. Her hands trembled as she twisted the waterproof latches. Inside were multiple sealed flash drives, a compact camera, a thick notebook wrapped in oilcloth, and a manila envelope addressed in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. Margaret picked up the letter first. "If this reaches you, then they forced your hand.
I'm sorry.
I thought I could shield you from this." Her vision blurred, but she forced herself to continue reading. Thomas detailed what he had discovered. Shipments moved through the old mining tunnel beneath the eastern ridge. High-value contraband. Weapons. Possibly worse. The isolation of the ranch made it perfect. Daniel had stumbled upon the tunnel years earlier and initially reported it out of curiosity. Instead of closing it off, he had been drawn in. There were names,
Dates.
transaction records, photographs. Margaret lowered the letter slowly. "He tried to gather enough to take to federal authorities," Elise said. "But someone inside local law enforcement tipped the operation off. After that, he became a liability." "Daniel?" Margaret asked quietly. Elise nodded once. Daniel wasn't the mastermind, but he became involved. Financial pressure, ambition, the wrong friends. Once he realized the scale, it was too late. Margaret stared at the flash drives. "And Rebecca?" she asked. "She's the strategist. She connected Daniel to the buyers. She handled the shell companies. She pushed for control of the land once your husband resisted." The warehouse felt suddenly airless. Margaret pressed her palms flat against the cold metal table. "They'll come for this," she said. "They already are," Elise replied. "Daniel's panicking. Panic makes mistakes." Margaret's grief shifted into something sharper, cleaner. "What's the plan?" Elise met her gaze. "We give them a chance to expose themselves. They need the container back. They'll do whatever it takes to get it." Margaret nodded slowly. "Tomorrow morning," Elise continued, "you send a message from your phone. You tell Daniel you're willing to talk. That you understand now. You'll return what you found." Margaret's voice hardened. "And when they come?" "They won't come alone," Elise said. "We'll be ready." Margaret thought of the knock at her door. The deputy. The threat masked as concern. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was awake. Outside, wind moved across the empty fields. Margaret closed the container carefully and looked at Elise with steady eyes. "For 43 years," she said quietly, "that land was my home. Tonight it became evidence." Elise gave a single, approving nod. "Then let's make sure it's used that way." Morning came gray and brittle, the kind of cold that settled into the joints and refused to leave. Margaret Ellison stood near the tall warehouse window, watching pale light stretch across the empty fields outside the abandoned grain facility. She had not slept. Grief and betrayal had burned away any softness inside her, leaving something sharper, steadier. Elise Carter leaned over a folding table reviewing documents pulled from the waterproof container. Aaron Pike had arrived before dawn, bringing 2 additional people Margaret did not recognize, federal agents who had been quietly building a larger case connected to the tunnel network beneath her ranch. Margaret hadn't realized how wide the web extended. "It's bigger than your property," Aaron said carefully. "The tunnel system connects to older mining routes that were never properly sealed. Your land just happens to be the cleanest entry point, private, inherited, and legally insulated." "And Daniel knew this?" Margaret asked. "He knew enough," Elise replied. "Rebecca knew more." Margaret absorbed that in silence. At 9:14 a.m., she sent the message. "I want to fix this. Come tonight. Alone. We can resolve it." The typing bubble appeared almost immediately. Daniel responded within seconds. I knew you'd understand.
Tonight.
8 p.m.
No hesitación. No suspicion.
That told Margaret everything she needed to know. The hours that followed were precise and methodical. Federal agents reviewed the flash drives, confirming transaction logs, recorded phone calls, GPS coordinates tied to shipments routed through the tunnel. The notebook Thomas had kept was meticulous. Dates, times, partial license plates, bank routing numbers traced to shell corporations Rebecca had helped establish. Margaret read portions of it in silence, each page dismantling the last remnants of denial she might have clung to. By late afternoon, the plan was finalized. The ranch house would appear unchanged. Margaret would be alone. The container would sit visibly on the kitchen table. Hidden cameras would record everything. Agents would wait out of sight beyond the tree line and in unmarked vehicles positioned along the access road. We need clear verbal admission, one agent explained. Intent, knowledge, coordination. Margaret nodded. I'll get it, she said. At 7:30 p.m., she returned home. The ranch house looked exactly as it always had, white siding faded by years of weather, porch light casting a soft yellow glow. But Margaret felt different walking inside. The fear that once lived in her chest had been replaced by focus. She placed the container at the center of the kitchen table. At 7:58, headlights appeared at the end of the long gravel drive. 2 vehicles. Margaret inhaled slowly. So much for coming alone. The first knock came at exactly 8:02 p.m. 3 firm taps. She opened the door. Daniel stood there, face pale but composed. Rebecca stood slightly behind him, her expression controlled, eyes calculating. And behind them, stepping out of the shadows, Deputy Harris. Margaret kept her voice steady. You brought company. Daniel forced a tight smile. Just precaution. Rebecca's gaze drifted to the table immediately. She saw the container. Relief flickered across her face before she masked it. You made the right choice, Rebecca said smoothly, stepping inside without invitation. Margaret closed the door behind them. Deputy Harris remained near the entrance, hand resting lightly on his belt. Daniel moved toward the table. You don't understand the scale of what you're interfering with, he began. Margaret's eyes locked onto his. Then explain it, she said calmly. Rebecca exhaled sharply. This land is part of something far larger than you realize. Infrastructure.
International client.
People who don't tolerate disruption. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Dad wouldn't listen. He thought he could shut it down quietly. That's not how it works. Margaret's voice didn't waver. What did you do? Silence filled the kitchen. Daniel swallowed. It wasn't supposed to go that far. Rebecca stepped in, irritated. He was going to expose everything. He left us no option. Margaret's pulse remained steady. So you forced his truck off the road. Daniel's face crumpled. We just meant to scare him. Make him back off. It was raining. He lost control. You followed him, Margaret said. You watched him die. Rebecca's composure cracked for the first time. He chose this. Those 3 words hung in the air. That was enough. The kitchen lights snapped brighter as hidden signals triggered. Voices thundered from outside. Federal agents. Hands where we can see them. The back door burst open. The front windows shattered inward as tactical teams moved with coordinated precision. Deputy Harris froze, hand halfway to his weapon before multiple rifles aimed squarely at his chest.
Down. Now.
Rebecca spun toward the container as if calculating one final move, but 2 agents had her restrained within seconds. Daniel dropped to his knees. Mom, he began. Margaret did not move. She watched as her son was cuffed, his wrists pulled behind his back. He looked smaller somehow. Younger, but not innocent. You set me up, he whispered hoarsely. Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. You set your father up. He broke then, shoulders shaking. Rebecca remained rigid even as cuffs tightened around her wrists. This won't end cleanly, she said coldly to Margaret. There are others. I know, Margaret replied. Deputy Harris was escorted out last, face drained of color. The house fell silent as quickly as it had erupted. Agents moved efficiently, collecting the container, securing evidence, photographing the scene. Elise stepped inside once the suspects were removed. It's done, she said softly. Margaret exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for months. But it wasn't relief she felt. It was clarity. She walked slowly to the kitchen window and looked out toward the dark outline of the eastern ridge. Beneath that soil lay tunnels that had nearly destroyed her family. Behind her, the remnants of that destruction had just been taken away in handcuffs. Elise approached quietly. He left you something else, she said, handing Margaret a folded legal document recovered from the container. It was a trust agreement, executed months before Thomas's death. Funds secured. Legal triggers established that would automatically involve federal oversight if the land was threatened by forced sale or guardianship proceedings. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. He knew, she whispered. He suspected he might not win, Elise said. So, he prepared you to finish it. Outside, red and blue lights flickered across the trees as vehicles pulled away one by one. Daniel was seated in the back of a federal SUV. As it passed the house, he looked up. For a split second, mother and son locked eyes through the glass. There was no anger in Margaret's gaze, only finality. The SUV disappeared down the drive. The ranch fell quiet again. But this time, the silence felt different. It was no longer hiding something. It was clearing. Margaret remained standing in the kitchen long after the last vehicle left, listening to the wind move through the trees. For the first time since Thomas's death, she did not feel watched. She felt anchored. The truth was no longer buried beneath her land. It was out in the open, and nothing would ever grow there the same way again. The house felt cavernous after the arrests. Not quiet in the gentle way Margaret Ellison remembered from early mornings with Thomas, but hollow, as if something structural had been removed from its foundation. For 2 days after the operation, federal vehicles came and went along the gravel drive. Survey teams walked the eastern ridge with ground-penetrating equipment. Markers were placed. Sections of soil were excavated. Temporary fencing appeared where the tunnel entrance had been concealed for years beneath brush and rock. Margaret watched most of it from the porch. She did not interfere. She did not ask unnecessary questions. The agents, now less guarded, treated her with a mixture of respect and caution. She was both victim and key witness. Her statement alone carried weight, but the evidence Thomas had gathered carried far more. By the end of the first week, news began to circulate beyond the county. Regional papers picked up fragments of the story: an illegal transport network, misuse of private land, local law enforcement corruption. Names were not yet public, but it was only a matter of time. Margaret did not turn on the television. Instead, she walked. Each morning at sunrise, she stepped out across the frost-covered fields and followed the fence line the way she and Thomas once had, checking posts, scanning the tree line. The land looked the same, but it felt altered. Knowing what had existed beneath it changed its texture in her mind. On the 5th morning, Elise Carter joined her walk. They've sealed the primary shaft, Elise said as they approached the eastern ridge. Secondary access points are being mapped. It will take months to document everything. Margaret nodded. And Daniel? He's cooperating, Elise replied carefully. He realized quickly that the evidence was overwhelming. Margaret absorbed that without visible reaction. And Rebecca? Less cooperative. She's trying to negotiate leverage. But the financial trails are solid. Margaret stopped walking and looked toward the ridge, where temporary floodlights now stood over exposed ground. For years, she said quietly, I thought grief was the heaviest thing I would ever carry. I was wrong. Elise studied her. You're holding up better than most would. Margaret gave a faint, humorless smile. Strength isn't loud. It's stubborn. Over the following weeks, investigators uncovered far more than Margaret had imagined. The tunnel system extended into natural rock chambers large enough to store vehicles. There were reinforced sections added within the last 5 years. Hidden ventilation shafts, disguised as old irrigation structures. Sophisticated communication equipment. Daniel had not built it, but he had helped modernize it. That knowledge settled into Margaret slowly, like sediment in still water. Legal proceedings moved quickly. Formal charges were announced publicly. Daniel faced counts related to conspiracy, illegal transport of controlled weapons, obstruction of justice, and involvement in negligent homicide tied to Thomas's staged accident. Rebecca faced additional charges for financial fraud, racketeering, and coordination of interstate transfers. Deputy Harris resigned before indictment, but was later arrested under federal warrant. The first court appearance drew media attention. Margaret chose not to attend. Instead, she remained on the ranch, sitting at the kitchen table where everything had unfolded weeks earlier. The container no longer sat there. The flash drives were in federal custody. The notebook Thomas had written was secured as evidence. But his letter remained with her. She read it again that afternoon. I hope to spare you this. But if it reaches you, it means you were stronger than I was allowed to be. Tears came then, not sharp and violent like the night she learned the truth, but steady and quiet. Thomas had known. He had anticipated the possibility that his silence might not be enough. He had trusted her to finish what he started. Late autumn turned toward winter. The investigative teams gradually reduced their presence. The temporary fencing remained, but the heavy machinery left. The land began to breathe again. Margaret made decisions carefully. She met with Thomas's attorney, who confirmed the details of the trust he had established months before his death. Funds were secured not only for her lifetime, but for long-term preservation of the property. Legal mechanisms were in place preventing forced sale without independent federal review. He built safeguards anticipating pressure, the attorney explained. He knew once the operation accelerated, you would be targeted. Margaret signed updated documents transferring specific oversight responsibilities to an independent land conservancy. She did not want the ranch vulnerable again, not to family, not to corporations, not to hidden interests. In early spring, she leased a portion of the western fields to a young couple committed to sustainable farming. They brought fresh equipment, repaired fences, and introduced life back into areas that had felt stagnant. Margaret found quiet comfort in hearing new voices across the acreage. The eastern ridge remained closed off pending final federal clearance. Months later, Margaret visited Daniel. The federal detention facility was colder than she expected, sterile, echoing. When he entered the visitation room, he looked thinner, older. The arrogance that once sharpened his features had dissolved into something more fragile. He sat across from her, hands folded. I never meant for him to die, he said immediately. Margaret studied her son's face. I know, she replied calmly. But you meant to protect something else more than you meant to protect him. Daniel's eyes filled. They told me it was temporary, that it would bring stability, that once we were financially secure, we could step away. And when did you realize that wasn't true? Margaret asked. He didn't answer. Silence stretched between them. Your father loved you, Margaret said finally. Even when he knew. Daniel's head snapped up. He knew. He confronted you, she said evenly. He still hoped you would choose differently. Daniel's composure fractured. Margaret did not reach across the table. She did not withdraw either. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said truthfully. But I won't carry hatred. That would only bury more things that need air. Daniel nodded slowly, tears falling unchecked. When she stood to leave, he did not ask her to stay. Outside the facility, Margaret inhaled deeply. The sky was clear. For the first time in months, she felt something close to balance. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Mornings were spent in the garden, afternoons reviewing conservation plans, evenings quiet but no longer tense. The land, once evidence of betrayal, began to feel like home again. Not untouched, but reclaimed. One evening near the anniversary of Thomas's death, Margaret walked to the eastern ridge alone. Federal crews had completed their work. The primary shaft was permanently sealed with reinforced concrete and documented in state and federal records. Warning markers remained, but the danger beneath had been neutralized. She stood there as the sun dipped low, casting gold across the fields. For 43 years, she said softly into the wind, this was our life. The trees responded with a gentle rustle. I finished it, she added. Grief did not disappear. It changed shape. The betrayal that once felt like a fracture became something else, a boundary she now understood clearly. Family was not defined by blood alone. It was defined by choice. Margaret turned back toward the house. The porch light glowed warm against the darkening sky. The ranch was still standing.
So was she.
The truth that had nearly destroyed everything was no longer hidden beneath soil and secrecy. It was documented, exposed, acknowledged. And in its place, something stronger had taken root. Not silence, not fear, but clarity. And that, Margaret knew, would endure longer than any tunnel ever could.